First off, thanks for agreeing to do an interview, or actually
Yeah,
thanks for contacting me to do the interview. Is a good motivation for me to start doing interviews on the channel because it's something I've been meaning to do.
yeah,
First off, what is your background and the company's background? How did this all start?
yeah. Absolutely. Well, I guess it really started with, I guess you could say, my entrepreneurial journey. So, I got roughly a decade ago, got tired of working for other people and decided I was going to do my own thing. And literally that was the extent of the thinking. It was no deeper than that. Background is an aerospace engineer with an emphasis on sort of materials and structures and things like that. So not a battery person by training per se, but the last group that I worked for, I had inherited a lithium-ion battery group. So that was my introduction to batteries, battery materials. This would have been in the late 2000s. And there, I ran that group for a couple of years, transitioned them from basic R&D to really a much more product focus. In this case, it was targeted more for military applications. So that was really it. I got connected in. So, now fast forward a year or two, about a year-ish into my entrepreneurial journey, I got connected into a couple of professors from the University of Colorado just through some professional society networking here in the Front Range. And they were looking for, really someone with more of some business expertise specific to battery systems. And this was in, 2012. And there was very little battery activity. So you could sort of think of me as kind of the tallest dwarf, so to speak. I was the most qualified, but it wasn't putting the bar real high. Now that has changed. There's a lot of battery people around here. And I'd like to think that we contributed to that. But yeah, that was really the long and short of it. And so from 2012 on, I basically represented Solid Power, first negotiating with the university to get the license agreement in place, and then going out and trying to secure some early stage capital. And then we physically left the university in January of 2014. So we've been our own operating entity for 6.5 years now.
There's a couple of things you touched on there that I've been interested in. One is the military technology thing. It's a rabbit hole I still need to go down. And the other was the University of Colorado. It seems like Louisville has a lot of startups. Is that because of the university in the area? And can you give us any insights as to why it's such a fertile ground for battery technology? Is it because of the military and aerospace applications in the area?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll start with the latter question first. So I would say that, and again, I really should emphasize that a lot of this battery stuff has been a relatively recent development. So 10 years ago, we certainly could not claim that we were a battery hotbed. But I think we've become a reputable player in battery development here in the United States. And I would say that it is primarily due to the research institutions here, and that's a combination of we do have NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, which is in Golden. We have, our leading research institutions. We have 3 of them: Colorado School of Mines, also down in Golden, of course, University of Colorado Boulder, and then Colorado State University, which is up in Fort Collins. And they all 3 of those, in one way or another, have fairly robust research programs in, I would say, battery materials to a degree, but then just basic material science research. And of course, and even NREL starting to expand. Historically, they've been more like kind of battery characterization, battery integration kind of stuff, but they're starting to get much stronger in battery materials. So I would say that's really the foundation for that ecosystem. And then, that it just obviously it takes time for that to pay dividends. And so that's why now here in, 2020, you're starting to see so much activity really happening. And then to your second question about Louisville, it's funny. Louisville's a small town. I mean, I think we're like 10, 15,000 people. I don't even live in Louisville. I live up in Longmont. Why so many battery startups? And, startups in particular have landed here. It is a little strange because there's not that much space here. There's one tech park, which is by and large where the majority of us are located. So maybe I can comment as to why we, Solid Power, are located here. And that is because probably don't want to be in Boulder. I think anyone doing sort of quote unquote hard tech or hardware oriented stuff, it's just going to, you're going to run into challenges in Boulder. Boulder is expensive. There's not a lot of selection of properties. There's a lot of regulatory crap in Boulder. And so by and large, most startups, now when I say most, that's outside of things like software. If you're a software startup, yeah, you'll probably stay in Boulder. Everybody else leaves Boulder. And Louisville's the next town over. How's that?
Sweet, yeah, that works for me. I come from a small town of about 10 to 15,000 people, and I now live in a city in Wellington, in New Zealand, and there's been a big difference I've seen in the ability to get things done in a small town with a manufacturing and agricultural backbone than it is in a bureaucratic city environment.
Yeah, and I think there's an element of that. It also should be noted that on the one hand, while I say Louisville's only 10 to 15,000, it is still really an extension of the greater Denver metro area. I mean, we are on the edge, so my back is to the west. Mountains are behind me. There's no more city behind me because that's the Boulder green space. But everything that way is Denver, is city, from here all the way to downtown Denver. So we're kind of on the edge of that sprawl, shall we say.
Yeah, you get the benefits of both small town and having the resources of the city to draw from. Now, we should probably start getting into the technology. Why solid state? What are the benefits of solid state? Just give me an idea of why Solid Power has focused on solid state as a technology.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I think anyone can probably wrap their head around that if you are an end user of a battery, so let's just say you're an electric vehicle manufacturer or you're some sort of portable device manufacturer, you're looking for more energy out of your battery without having to pay for it in the form of a much larger battery or much heavier battery, right? Because ultimately, in the battery business, we call it, you have a certain capacity of a battery to meet a operational performance you want to meet, and that of course comes with a certain mass and volume. You'd love to get that mass and volume lower, or conversely get more capacity out of the cell. In the battery business, we call that specific energy or energy density. So it's just that constant drive, because that is directly proportional to, for example, the range of your electric vehicle on a given charge. So there's that. There's also overlaid is the sort of lithium ion, which it basically has remained largely unchanged since it was introduced in the early 90s. This metal oxide cathode combined with a carbon-based anode. Yes, we've made improvements to each of those, but what I just said has continued to hold true. That's essentially what lithium ion is. And that's well and good, but the challenge is that the community's done a fantastic job in eking out every bit of energy out of that electrode combination. And so the realization is that the performance gains that are coming from that, from lithium ion are getting smaller and further in between. So you're starting to approach a plateau, performance plateau. But of course, the market pull for improved energy has not gone away. And so that's the overarching context for where really new energy story chemistries come into play, and where solid state comes into play. And it really comes into play not so much solid state, but lithium metal. Lithium metal as an anode material has the highest theoretical capacity. So on paper, if you're looking to significantly improve the energy of your cell, simply replacing that carbon-based anode with lithium metal is the most direct pathway. Of course, easier said than done. And it's that easier said than done is where solid state comes into play. Solid state is a platform really to enable things like lithium metal to work, or even to enable some very exotic other cathode chemistries like conversion reaction and things like that. But first and foremost, the focus is on on lithium metal, which cannot be used in a conventional liquid electrolyte lithium ion based system. So that's the main value proposition. There are some other secondary value propositions like safety. You no longer have that volatile, flammable electrolyte. That's really the spark that leads to a combustion event under, something like an abuse condition or a thermal runaway. That's gone. And so you have a cell that basically is highly resistant to thermal runaway. And that's great. The reason we like safety is I like to say a safer cell is a lower cost cell. And the reason for that is at the pack level, you can potentially reduce a lot of features, and that drives down pack cost.
Great. That was going to be a question I ask you, because people often think of the battery cells in isolation of the pack. But part of the reason why lithium iron phosphate has been successful, at least in my knowledge, I haven't done a deep dive yet, is because it's so much safer, you don't have to create as much pack and packaging around that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's usually limited to big batteries. For example, the smartphone, the battery and cell are by and large one and the same. There's not a lot of other ancillary stuff. That's not true in an EV. That thing is encased in a whole lot of stuff, and that stuff equates to cost.
Now, digging a little bit deeper, you mentioned a pure lithium anode. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know how much detail you can get into about your technology. I appreciate a lot of this can be trade secret, particularly because you're not a publicly traded company. Are you using an anode-less, which is just a bare copper anode? All right, great. And why would you use...
No, hold on. Okay. No, we're not.
Okay.
I was acknowledging yes, I am familiar with what you're referring to.
Okay, cool. So you are using a thin layer of lithium rather than a bare copper plate. Now, why have you chosen that path versus the pure copper plate?
Right. And basically because that a lot of people call it a lithium-free anode, or some of them even say anode-free. It is extremely hard. It again, in theory, it's very elegant, but in practice, it's very, very challenging. You're pulling lithium out of the cathode and plating it onto the surface of the substrate, which in this case would just be a bare copper substrate. And it really gets to the underlying technical challenge that you're endeavoring to address when you're using lithium in a rechargeable, and that is this issue of dendrites. So dendrites occur due to non-uniform plating of that lithium. So on the charge cycle, you have lithium coming from the cathode and it's plating back onto the surface of the lithium. And in an ideal world, it would plate nice and uniformly, and so your lithium would just go like this during the charge and discharge cycle. However, we don't live in a non-uniform world. It has a tendency to do all kinds of weird stuff, and that weird stuff can lead to what we call in the business these dendrites. That is even more exacerbated when you go to this kind of lithium-free sort of anode approach. You've got to come up with some sort of way to enable that uniform plating. And I'll use an example. The Samsung research group came out with a really excellent publication earlier this year where they did just that. They demonstrated a lithium-free anode. But they did it, they used a lot of techniques that had questionable scalability, as well as some potentially very exotic materials that could be very, very costly. So for example, they had to put down a silver nanocomposite layer on that surface. So they weren't just plating to pure or just plain old copper. There was a plating surface, and that plating surface was composed of a fairly exotic material. Then they had to use things like isostatic pressure for producing the cell. That was also very, very key. And isostatic pressures are great for building one or two cells, but it's certainly not a continuous roll-to-roll process. And so there were some questions about the ability of that to scale. So I by no means am I disparaging the work that the Samsung group did. It was incredibly impressive. But by no means did they also close the book on lithium metal solid state. There's still some work that needs to be done.
Awesome. You're answering some of the questions that I had lined up
Perfect.
here, so
Yeah,
that's really good.
perfect.
Because it's one thing to make one cell in a lab, and there's another thing to mass produce it. And
Yep.
my understanding is that's what you're getting into now. And one of the things that really piqued my interest is I think you have a video on YouTube where it actually shows your manufacturing process, and you're using a typical roll-to-roll process for what
Yes.
you're doing.
Yes.
Can you get into a little bit of detail um, about that manufacturing process, or at least what stage of
Yeah.
scaling this you're at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the latter question first. So what we have built and are operating right now is a megawatt hour scale roll to roll production line. Think of it like a pilot line. And so it has the exact same equipment that you would see in a gigafactory, except perhaps each piece of equipment might be a bit smaller, and then there's only one of them. So if you go into a gigafactory, you just see row and row and row of lines and lines and lines. Think of what we have as a single line and then a bit smaller. And again, to put it in a rough order of magnitude, the line itself was built to handle about 10 megawatt hours based on an annual capacity production volume. So again, not a gigafactory, but a megafactory. Now, why are we able to manufacture in a manner that is identical to lithium ion? It really comes down to the unique property of the specific class of solid electrolyte or solid state cell that we work on, which is itself tied to the class of solid electrolytes. So we work exclusively in what's called sulfide based. So, again, sulfur containing materials. And while they are indeed an inorganic material, unlike most inorganics, the sulfides are very soft and malleable material. They can be deformed or conformed very, very easily. Changing particle size and particle size distribution can be done very, very easily. It's unique to the sulfides. And so what we do is we start with bare powder. If we're going to coat a cathode, we will combine our electrolyte with the cathode active material. Today, we're working with an industry standard 622 NMC. And then we will make a slurry out of that. So we will have a carrier solvent. We will have a polymer binder, just like you do in lithium ion as a processing aid. And then if it's a cathode layer, we'll have a conductive additive. We'll make a big slurry batch out of that using the same mix equipment that you see in lithium ion. We then coat using the same slot die coaters, densify using the same roll-to-roll calendars, et cetera. And again, it's unique to the relatively soft mechanical properties of sulfides that allows us to do that.
Are you limited to a specific cell type, or do you have a preferred cell type? And what I mean by cell type is cylindrical, pouch,
Yep.
or
Yep.
prismatic.
Gotcha. So today we build a stacked pouch cell. And as a battery development company, we're not going to develop all cell formats in parallel. It's just biting off more than we can chew, so to speak. So as a first product, we need to pick one. And frankly, that would be my advice to any battery startup. Pick one format that makes sense for you. Because nothing's ever a drop-in replacement. You always have to tweak this or tweak that to make it work right. And trust me, it's always harder than you realize. So today we build a stacked pouch cell. It also helps that all of our customers have a preference for a pouch type cell. So in other words, our OEM partners, by and large, none of them have used cylindricals, I don't believe. They have used some prismatics, but they have a tendency either for pouch type or prismatic type. So for us, pouch just made sense. It was the simplest form for us to work towards. And that by and large will be our format, at least for the foreseeable future.
All right. And just jumping back a second to you're talking about the sulfide based solid state electrolyte. My understanding is there's three classes: polymer, oxide, and sulfide. Now, there's also a lot of other research papers talking about glass type, ceramic type. How do those, this is for my own education, how do these two things interact? Are oxides primarily ceramics? Are sulfides, how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the glass is just sort of defines, and again, I'm not a chemist, so don't hold my feet to the fire on this. But glasses are sort of a form, if you will. So, for example, sulfites can be rendered as a glass. You know, it would require probably different process, well, definitely different processes than what we're working with. But certainly I am aware of the existence of sulfite glass. Of course, that brings along other challenges of handling. And of course, when you end up with a glass, you end up with a real tangible, hard, brittle interface that, generally speaking, batteries don't like, because that represents a significant resistance, if you will. And that really segues into one of the big challenges for the oxides, which oxides are basically like a conventional ceramic. Hard and brittle material. They're processed like a ceramic. It require very, very high temperatures, high pressure. We call it sintering. And the end product is a hard ceramic. And so that represents a bunch of challenges. How do you do that in a high throughput, continuous manner? Certainly can't do it in roll to roll. How do you integrate in, for example, the cathode active material, or really any of your active materials, because none of those can tolerate, in particular, the sintering temperatures, because they're quite high. And so, you know, honestly, I'm not aware of any group that really has demonstrated that manufacturability at scale. At least as far as I'm concerned, that continues to be the major technical hurdle of the oxides. Polymers are an interesting one. They have the most legacy, at least with the bulk type solid state batteries. So, for example, Bolloré, and with the work originating with Hydro-Quebec, were really the first group to demonstrate at scale these polymer-based solid state batteries. The challenge that those materials and those cells faced is that they had quite low ionic conductivities, several orders of magnitude lower than the inorganic solid electrolyte materials. And so as a consequence, you had to heat the cell, I think above about 80 degrees Celsius, to where the ionic conductivity was high enough that you could get current out of the cell. But then on the other side of the temperature threshold, as a polymer, they can still degrade. And so I think they had to be held to between about 80 to 90 degrees Celsius at all times. And that is a challenge. I would think you're almost simultaneously heating and cooling the pack to keep it within that very narrow and elevated temperature range. And so that by and large really closed the book on polymer solid state, with the exception of a few more recent groups that have demonstrated much higher ionic conductivities than those legacy systems. But everything I've seen is still, you know, sort of laboratory scale data. So I think it's certainly worthy to keep an eye on those particular groups as they mature.
This is probably a good opportunity to get into more of the specs and details of the battery that you have. And once again, if you can't share it, all good.
Absolutely.
In terms of conductivity, current density, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
what types of charge and discharge rates are you hitting? Energy density at the cell or the pack level?
Yep.
The types of specs that people are always tend to be interested in.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, let me. So I'm happy to share performance data and where we sort of stand. I would hesitate to use the word specification because we're just simply not there yet. We are making constant improvements in the performance of our cells. Heck, not just an hour ago, I sat through a meeting where we were reviewing the latest data on the data that we've achieved with our production line cells. So basically we're in the process of continuing to push the envelope. And then the other thing that I'll do is I'll sort of segregate what we've achieved, sort of our legacy data, which we've achieved on what we call laboratory scale cells. Our definition is anything that requires hand built is laboratory scale. By definition, they're sort of one-off cells. And then the real data that we're really starting to share with people today is the data that we're collecting on our production line cells. And so these are all automated built cells for which, we're building them in, hundreds per week. So we certainly don't have nearly as much data on those production line cells, just because the production line, we've only been collecting data since, I would say, late April. So it's still quite fresh. Anyway, so I'll start first with the energy. So with the cells coming off of our production line, the ones that we are building in, hundreds per week, those are in about the low to mid 300s watt hour per kilogram and about mid 600 watt hour per liter. In our view, still pretty modest. With a lithium metal and an NMC cathode combination, our cell design roadmap has us achieving about in the low to mid 400 watt hour per kilo and close to about 1,000 watt hour per liter. So we still have a significant amount of headroom there. But yeah, so that's the energy of the cells we're building today. We are doing production trials on cells that achieve, I think, as high as 350 watt hour per kilogram. And the only thing we're doing different is we're building increasingly thinner electrolyte separator layers, because that's what has the biggest impact on our energy. In terms of where those cells are at is we're testing those cells in 3 temperature regimes today, a high of 70 degrees Celsius, then 45 degrees Celsius, and then room temperature. We're testing several different parameters. We're doing rate sweeps. So I think at 70 degrees Celsius, we're going up to as high as a 5C discharge. And then at 45 in room temperature, we're going up to a discharge rate of 1C. And then cycle life testing those cells. And again, we're collecting data right now, but the cells are approaching 200 cycles. And that is at both 70 and 45 degrees Celsius. So it's a little bit of a case of stay tuned. Now, those are the production line cells. Data has been collected since late April. What we've demonstrated with our lab scale cells is we have demonstrated close to our long-term target, which is 1,000 cycles based on an 80% discharge capacity retention threshold. So I don't think we've met it precisely, but we've gotten darn close with some of our hand-built pouches. And then we've demonstrated at elevated temperature some extremely high current densities. The caveat being this is with a very innovative and sort of next-gen electrolyte that has not yet transitioned to production. But it achieved a current density before shorting of, I think, 34 milliamps per square centimeters. That equates to about a 10C charge and discharge rate. Again, lab scale cell, so very impressive. Need to translate those results over to our production line cells, but at least it shows that the performance potential is indeed there.
Yeah, that's exciting.
It is.
What types of, you've mentioned, I believe it's auto OEM, so I'm assuming that's your target market for these batteries.
Long term.
What types of expectations do they have for you? And what sort of time frames do they have? What sort of expectations do they have for delivery? Like 2025, or is this still just highly experimental and finding out where the technology can go?
No, I mean, we are working to, I don't want to say set in concrete timeline, but a rough timeline for a vehicle start of production. I would say at the absolute soonest 2026 and more probable 2027 into 2028. And then we do have a set of performance targets for that particular cell. And so between now and then, it's really just about achieving all the performance metrics. Our roadmap has us doing that by 2023. The emphasis on 2023 is when we anticipate concluding B sample phase. And in the automotive world, that's a full design freeze. everything's frozen. Your material, your cell design's frozen, your materials are frozen. And at that point, you're only going through production scale. So for us, 2024 and 2025 that's when we start to talk about gigafactories.
Excellent. That sounds totally reasonable. People are always asking about when solid state is expected to arrive, and in my mind's eye, that's where I have it sitting. Now,
Yep.
What is a V sample? Is that volume sampling?
So first of all, that's automotive terminology. And so in the automotive world, in the automotive battery world, they have sort of this 4-step process. And they call it an A sample, a B sample, C, and then some people say D sample, some people just say cell startup production. And different auto OEMs have slightly different definitions of what that means, but by and large, they're pretty similar. A sample phase, so first of all, A sample, you're full scale. So don't think you're starting small, even at an A sample. You are full scale, which we're targeting approximately a 100 amp hour cell. You would successfully exit an A sample phase and into B sample phase when you've demonstrated, usually it will be somewhere between 80 to 90% performance target compliance, meaning you have met all of your performance requirements roughly to about 80 to 90% compliance. So cycle life, your safety, your energy, your temperature, all those things. And then B sample is really when you take it from that 80 to 90 to 100%. Because successfully exiting B sample is, as I said before, that's full design freeze. And you can't freeze the design until you're meeting requirements. I mean, that's engineering 101. And so, and by the way, in terms of cell volumes, you're probably looking at in an A sample somewhere between 1500 to 2000. B sample, you're probably talking 3,000 to 5,000 cells. So all those performances are validated over a decent volume of cells. And then again, as I said before, at the end of B sample, full design freeze. And at that point, you are now moving into production.
That's excellent information. In fact, I've been looking around for months trying to get a view of how OEMs actually test these cells and like how many cells they need, how much volume they need at each point, because I understand it's a process that takes quite a while. Now, you may or may not be able to answer this, but assuming that you have all your ducks in a row as a producer and a manufacturer, how long does it take to get through their process? Is it a year, 2 years? Yeah. Do you have any insights there?
Well, I guess the simple answer to that is as long as it takes. So as long as you demonstrate those compliance with those requirements over a sufficient volume of cells. I would say a good rule of thumb is per stage is typically going to be on the order of at least a year. So think 12 months for A sample. B sample might be a little longer, let's say 12 to 18 months. And then, C and D sample could be shorter, but it's contingent upon, because at that point, then you're getting into manufacturing, and then you're talking probably deploying a lot of capital. And so that might be a limiter. But you could kind of think of each stage as being no less than 12 months would be a good rule of thumb.
All right. And do you have any insights on the type of tests they perform? Is it high precision coulometry, temperature testing, piercing tests?
All of the above. Full suite of abuse testing. Nail penetration seems to be falling out of favor for things like crush, but of course overcharge, arc calorimetry, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's a full suite of tests out there that they will subject them to.
Is there anything
else?
That's why
they need so many cells.
Yeah.
It's a big test matrix.
Yeah. Yeah, they have to flog them. I've seen some of the rooms that they have, I think, in like Samsung, where you just have an entire room filled with thousands of cells connected to monitoring machines to see how they cycle and see how consistent they are across that volume.
Yeah, we have one of those rooms.
I'd love to check that out. Is there anything else, anything that you'd like to cover off that you feel like we've missed? Because we've hit most of the questions I have. And it's been really informative for me.
Yeah. Well, we haven't talked too much about safety. Safety is one where, obviously that can, if you're not careful, that can bite you in the butt, so to speak. And, we're going through a fairly extensive amount of safety testing as we speak. In fact, I was just confirmed that we'll have a lot of cells getting shipped to an external safety testing house that we use, because we can't, other than just ad hoc rudimentary safety testing, we're not equipped to do formal, our calorimetry or thermal runaway, that sort of thing. We have to use an external testing service for that. So we have already done that testing on cells up to 2 amp hours and have shown, for example, pure resistance to thermal runaway. And so now we're going to repeat that testing with more cells, with, quote unquote aged cells, so cells that have been cycled an increasingly number of times, because that will lead to a greater tendency to go into thermal runaway. So certainly can't close the book on safety, but I will say it's looking very, very promising. With the 2 amp hour cells that we tested, or had tested, I should say, we essentially showed that took it up to a 225% state of charge, so essentially 10 volts, and no thermal runaway whatsoever. In fact, the only thing that we measured was a 7 degrees Celsius increase in the skin temperature of the cell, so the cell warmed, and the pouch puffed a little bit. And we fully expected that, because you're going to get some oxygen coming out of the cathode when you take it up to that voltage. But that was it. Whereas a similar capacity lithium ion cell would have absolutely gone into thermal runaway under that condition. So it is very exciting. It is still preliminary, because we need, as I said before, we need to do testing on as well as bigger cells. So that'll happen later this fall. But still extremely encouraging. And, we're super excited, because you cannot forget the safety potential, and that could be a major game changer for big battery systems like EVs.
Absolutely. And are you working, I know you have auto OEM partners, or my understanding is you have auto OEM partners. Do they have, constant insight into what you're doing, and they're giving you advice as to what they
Very
need?
close. Very close.
Excellent. All right, to close things off, thanks for the interview today. I really appreciate it. This is the first interview I've done, and I think it's one that people will enjoy. I don't think there's enough coverage out there on solid state. It is something that I do see as further into the future, but 5 years is going to go by quickly, and
absolutely,
we need to have our eye on the horizon as to what's next. So I appreciate your time, and hope to speak again at some point.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, Doug.